Delighted to join everyone today to talk about telecom threat intelligence sharing and the road to propagation, by which subtitle I mean to prompt the question in people's minds, are we actually on it? And I'm going to outline an argument that calls for greater threat intelligence sharing in mobile telecoms are imperative today, but they're also premature. And I'll seek to illustrate why the pursuit of capability development must be prioritized, not only as the quickest pathway to optimized threat intelligence sharing, but as the critical imperative to actually enable it in the first place. Because as I will highlight, there was a systemic deficit, collectively speaking, of the capacity to detect threats in mobile signaling here, specifically for the context of this presentation, which is, of course, necessary precursor to threat sharing to begin with. So in doing so, I seek to build on discourse of last year's Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit, which spoke to organizational barriers to threat intelligence sharing. And to put my presentation just to touch off an important point, we just heard from a previous speaker on the challenge of cost and implementation. That's absolutely acknowledged. So the context of my presentation is the overall state of play in terms of intelligence production is not where it needs to be for that benefit to actually even be realized, even if we had an ideal state of intelligence sharing, which Patrick actually paraphrased in his introduction. There's only so far you can get with intelligence sharing if the capacity of the system and the system actors is inadequate in terms of being aligned with the actual environment. So more specifically, I will be speaking about why system level barriers to intelligence production precede organizational barriers to sharing, and how a vicious circle that is a two-speed telecom security ecosystem today inhibits the production of mobile telecoms threat intelligence in the first place. I'll talk about why systemic deficits in signaling intelligence increasingly also implicate cyber threat intelligence production more broadly. And I'll talk about the critical role in this respect of qualitative thresholds to enable incident reporting and other associated aspects of that. And finally, I'll talk about how breaking this cycle means bolstering capability. And that's our best way to ensure that we are indeed on the path to propagation. And that this will be, to borrow and embellish the metaphor used by our previous speaker, the tide that will raise all boats, or this is how we actually raise the tide in respect of mobile telecoms intelligence. The problem of threat intelligence sharing is, of course, not unique to mobile telecoms industry. As you see from this quote from the European Central Bank, now almost 10 years ago, in which it states that the industry has talked for years about intelligence sharing, the need for it, but few and insufficient initiatives have been taken in that direction. This quote, of course, holds true for many industries. So while it is not new and certainly not unique to mobile telecoms, it is arguably uniquely important in respect of mobile telecoms because of the way that mobile telecommunications transcend and intersect across industries in such a profound way, more than any other. I should acknowledge, of course, some very important initiatives that actually are underway. And indeed, globally, there are myriad information sharing groups, communities, and frameworks. And what I've highlighted on the screen are two, of course, of overarching importance and no doubt familiar to everyone on the call here today, the GSMA's ISAC group. And I've also highlighted the MISP threat sharing platform, which is notable for its evolution actually in recent years as well, from a platform initially focused on malware information to cyber threats more broadly, including, of course, among other things, an SS7 attack schema. And while there have been important contributions in that particular context, we haven't come nearly close enough to exploiting the actual value that this framework, this important framework, is actually set up to enable. It is proven extremely slow to actually mature. And of course, if there's recognition here, as clearly these initiatives reflect a very serious concerted effort to promote information sharing, why is it not where it needs to be? Well, as highlighted at last year's Telecom Threat Intelligence Summit, there are barriers. There are factors that inhibit information sharing, as highlighted here by the Cyber Threat Alliance's Michael Daniel, credit for that graphic and highlighting those factors. These factors are also important to consider at the system level, because they, in some cases, and I have highlighted here, cultural barriers in particular, they can manifest in a different way, which is key to understanding how they work. And to foreground that in respect of cultural barriers at the system level, we can look at it through the lens of doctrine. Cybersecurity as a doctrine is largely confined in practical terms today to the IT and computer-related context of work. And of course, there is no single definition, and there's arguments, of course, there does not need to be any single definition of cybersecurity. But as Anisa have highlighted, again, now almost 10 years ago, additional to this controversy, the term cybersecurity has become understood by some people as a synonym. So there's a cognitive confinement in terms of approach and understanding of the term to IT security, ICT security, and information security, which has the effect of creating a divide, counterintuitive sounding divide between cybersecurity on the one hand and telecom security on the other hand, a growth of separate disciplines, separate communities of practice, and importantly, in the context of threat intelligence sharing, a stovepiping of expertise, knowledge, and intelligence is actually produced. Stovepiping, of course, is an important term, famously attached to strategic intelligence failures that result of a lack of communication between stakeholders who possess insights of relevance to one another within organizations, but also between organizations, public and private, in national contexts, and of course in international contexts. So you might say, but if we're talking about different things, then why should stovepiping even present a problem for us? And the answer is that these fields may indeed be distinct, but they're far from discrete from one another. Nor indeed are the risks and the vulnerabilities, the actors and activities, which increasingly intersect in these fields. And the imperatives arising from this intersection are recognized in defense circles. So I'm grateful here for Kieran Martin's point on it being useful for people to read government strategy documents, because I have cited two on the screen here, no less. But to look at the language, firstly, from the example from the United States in the first place here, expressing concerns about a split in doctrine and organization that hinders coordination of closely related capabilities. In this case, referring to information operations, everything around cyberspace operations. Note that this is reflecting an idea of a suppression of overall capability, but also importantly, the recognition that adversaries don't confine themselves to any particular context or environment. They operate across environments. So defenders must adopt the same approach. Then the below example, the language from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence, stating that these key capability areas not having been integrated, as a result, the military is now trying to rebalance its understanding of the environments. There's important recognition here or acknowledgement of a blind spot. That is to say, of a misalignment between capabilities and the actual demands of the threat environment. Of course, doctrinal differences are far from trivial. At a functional level, there's very, very different education, expertise associated with the personnel and the experts in different realms, and of course, different tools in different systems. But they can be overcome. And this is an important example from the case of the Danish Cybersecurity Centre, whose 2022 threat assessment in respect of the telecom sector highlights the use of mobile signaling by state threat actors, and in particular highlights an espionage threat posed by state actor use of SS7 and Diameter as an attack platform. Globally, there is no more compelling case, an example of recognizing convergent cyber threats and overcoming these doctrinal differences within telecom security more broadly than that shown to us by Ukraine, where in 2014, Ukrainian authorities were the first to publish reports of signaling attacks, SS7 specifically, in the context of state-level threat activity, which notably was in furtherance of, not just alongside or in parallel to, military activity, the advent of hybrid warfare as we understand it and have come to understand it. And then with the most recent Russian invasion of the country, SS signaling attacks observed in the context of the world's first real cyber war, in which attempts to use captured telecoms infrastructure for attacks, including attacks with the language using signaling system 7, highlighted by Ukrainian authorities. So the cases of Ukraine and Denmark here demonstrate the relevance of signaling threats on the battlefield and off it. And yet this kind of recognition and resourcing is the exception today. It's not the rule. So why is that? Well, one important systemic factor is that attacks occur at the network providers level. This highlighted by Anisa, where providers usually have few signaling experts. And in most cases, they aren't part of SOC teams, IT security teams, or even security and fraud departments, and where there has been improvement since 2018, this still holds largely true today. Which would suggest worryingly that stovepiping might be an improvement on the telecom security side. This would suggest that intelligence isn't even being produced in the first place, which is indeed an important part of the systemic picture today. Or in short, because we don't know what we don't know. And we can't certainly share what we don't know. And these factors have led to what is, in very real terms, a two-speed telecom security ecosystem today, beginning with, I call it the siloing of cybersecurity as IT, or let's put it another way, an approach and resourcing of cyberspace as the internet, full stop, which has the effect of inhibiting collaborative knowledge creation in respect of actors and activities beyond that and surrounding that, which leads to a blind spot in which signaling threats are excluded from national threat pictures. At the same time, this means gaps in incident reporting for regulators and for national cybersecurity authorities, and also results, importantly, in a motivational dead space or a lack of incentive for operators to even resource protection in the first place. And this represents a kind of cycle within the overall vicious circle, where operators not having any regulatory requirement, for example, and little other incentive to resource requirement to identify such threats, do not report them, and regulators then are very, very unlikely to learn about the systemic need to actually support and enable, and where necessary to compel, the resourcing of the capacity to detect these kinds of threats, because the information isn't actually generated in the first place. This is compounded, of course, by the fact that signaling attacks today, by and large, are non-disruptive and low volume in absolute terms, in terms of metrics such as threshold, the proportion of the national user base, and the typical quantitative metrics used to describe that, and duration of hours. But attackers are generally below and know how to stay below those easily discoverable thresholds today to achieve their aims. In other words, this goes on invisibly in the background and relies on the exploitation of the service as delivered on the functioning telecoms networks. So the two-speed ecosystem in telecoms is one of security insight, innovation, and intelligence production and sharing, which has an effect over time of suppressing capability development, not only on the part of providers, but also on the part of competent authorities. This isn't just a case of additional intelligence to cyber threat intelligence that has been missed from the threat picture. This is very much a missing element of an evolving cyber threat picture today, because there's increasing intersection of signaling with wider threats. This graphic taken from the GSMA Security Threat Landscape Report for 2023, in which the role of interconnect attacks I have highlighted, wherein lacking optimized signaling protection, that is the filtering through which these threats are made visible in the first place, can leave operators and regulators blind to interconnect attacks. But this would also impact response to industry threats, such as spyware and human threats. There are others you will see and will be very readily recognizable as being implicated here as well. What I've highlighted here and with the dotted lines and boxes are those which would be less readily or intuitively identified as being downstream from a blind spot in relation to interconnect or signaling interconnect attacks. And the relevance of signaling security to spyware threats is highlighted in the GSMA Security Landscape Report, where it states that for network operators, close attention to SS7 signaling traffic, including the deployment and correct configuration, no word is superfluous or frivolous here, of signaling firewalls is crucial. This in the section on spyware. And I would also note that there are 6 cited examples of spyware attacks from 2022, which the GSMA highlight in this section of the report. And in 3 of those, there is a significant signaling related component to the threat activity, highlighting that intersection that I'm talking about. A key current systemic blind spot, and perhaps another counterintuitive element that is relevant today, pertains to SMS home routing. SMS home routing, of course, has long been recognized as an essential security measure, and there's been widespread adoption of measures worldwide, as shown by this chart taken from Enea from 2018, where the bar on the left shows close to 90% adoption. Doubtless that's actually higher today. However, misconfiguration issues, policy weaknesses still occur, but more importantly, bypass vulnerability abounds today, as do efforts by attackers to discover and exploit vulnerabilities associated with SMS home routing. And the risks posed by unauthorized intrusions that are enabled by exploitation of vulnerabilities associated with SMS home routing range from, of course, messaging abuse on the one end, to surveillance, up to and including spyware and malware deployment, as just referenced in respect of the GSMA Threat Landscape Report. In other words, this is a threat and vulnerability that has everything to do with SMS delivery and nothing to do with SMS delivery, and an area of exploitation by attackers. So how big can such a blind spot actually be? Well, the answer is global. So this is a real world example of global network reconnaissance that was enabled by the exploitation of an SMS home routing related vulnerability, and by an actor, one threat actor in one 24-hour period with signaling attack capabilities. This kind of activity is not unique, nor is the threat actor in their exploitation of it. Targeted regions as shown, up to 90% in this instance of telcos worldwide targeted, multiple per country, of course, as that would suggest. Note that while this is clearly mass, it is far from indiscriminate. It's important to highlight that. And the varying volumes of target subscribers And even whether there was incorporation of evasive elements or not from network to network and case to case by the attacker. Note the thresholds in this particular instance. In every case, less than 1% of the user base per telco. So this would not be captured. This would not be reported by a quantitative focused regulatory technical incident reporting framework that was based on that, in which that was the lowest threshold for significant impact and the only measure for significant impact. For attackers, however, the value is manifold. At one and the same time, they gain confirmation, of course, of access, intelligence on the protection levels in the networks that they're able to exfiltrate data from, and more importantly, and more specifically, intelligence on the bypass vulnerabilities of the particular network that returns the data to them. And of course, by the same token, newly exploitable target data, in this case, IMSIs of real subscribers at that time, valid per operator per country. The vulnerabilities exploited, note, it's not a single discrete technical vulnerability or issue. It's actually an exploitation of a systemic combination of weaknesses that threat actors have discovered, which is in the first place, the non-implementation of GSMA recommendations surrounding signaling protection and protection going beyond that, which caters to bypass techniques and efforts, and weak SMS home routing policies. And as a result, the non-alignment of SMS home routing and SS7 firewalling, which is perhaps a counterintuitive point, because these two elements of protection would not historically have been paired as prerequisite to network security. Attackers, however, have found ways to exploit vulnerabilities in these respects, SMS home routing and signaling protection, that make this an imperative and a systemic gap. This is why qualitative reporting thresholds are critical, and signaling protection can be key to capturing significant incidents that do not meet quantitative thresholds, such as the aforementioned, which I've given. Generally, it's the lowest 1% of the operator's national user base. That's why Enea, in highlighting the importance of qualitative and quantitative reporting thresholds, do not present it as an either-or option, but a matter of both and necessity today, because sometimes a small incident can be very significant. Overall, all thresholds must be applied. And to be clear here, qualitative impacts are those of significant economic or societal impact or geographic spread, for example, and they involve significant threats, in particular to confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. That's to say, everything aside from availability, but of course, signaling threat paradigm does extend to that as well. There are signaling denial of service attacks, which are we have treated of in our research on hybrid warfare in connection with Ukraine from last year into this year. Amid an environment in which threats against data are rising, this highlighted by Enea in their current threat landscape report, where data leakage and data manipulation, in addition to data breaches, are increasing in relevance, the need for signaling threat detection and intelligence capability also increases. Because this is a prime threat, but also the basis for many other threats, as all threats to data fundamentally are. And to illustrate that, in the case of signaling intelligence, I'll refer to media reporting surrounding so-called Team Jorge, a company which allegedly claims to conduct election interference, as part of which, in their toolset, the claim is that the signaling capability is used to hack Telegram accounts of targeted officials. Enea Adaptive Mobile Security's threat intelligence unit has detected and continues to detect threats entirely consistent with the kind of targeting activity described in that reporting. The activity comprises commands designed to intercept SMS security codes. In this particular case, the context is Telegram security codes. And this intelligence confirms that this national security threat is real. And put another way, that countries lacking advanced signaling protection, which is per GSMA recommendations, plus the capability to detect bypass techniques, are at risk of election interference, notwithstanding every other effort that is put in on endpoint and enterprise protection and malware protection, and you name it, if this protection isn't in place. And of course, this also means that providers can't share a threat they can't detect to begin with. There's no intelligence can actually be shared in this respect. So, breaking the cycle, I've alluded to the potential role for a regulatory intervention here. And this is actually highlighted by the ITU in their very, very new, just newly released Global Digital Regulatory Outlook report. Now, to be clear, the points made by the ITU are not in the context of promoting threat intelligence sharing, but actually about the benefits herein with regard to digital transformation more broadly, where they state that if connectivity is the economic cornerstone of society, then cybersecurity is the keystone of digital transformation. And the ITU highlight in respect of cybersecurity a need to bridge silos, as we've just talked about, and break through insularity, and the role for regulators to ensure cybersecurity governance by operators. In other words, how do resolving that impasse of not knowing what you don't know? How do we know that the threat picture that is presented is actually adequate? Do we have measurable assurance of the level of risk and exposure to unauthorized intrusions, data exfiltration, and data leakage associated with signaling vulnerabilities? And there's also recognition at a political level globally, but in this instance, I'm highlighting in the EU context, European Parliament context, because it's very current. In this case, the PEGA Committee of Inquiry into Pegasus and equivalent surveillance spyware, who also emphasize in their findings the role of national regulatory authorities. In short, the Committee of Inquiry's work went from, they arrived at a recognition that the problem is not just mobile spyware, the problem is one of mobile spying more broadly, because attackers don't confine themselves to any particular tool, as I've spoken to. So the initial draft report from PEGA highlighted the role of telcos in this context, but the final report had broadened scope of recommendations significantly to emphasize signaling-enabled surveillance and unauthorized intrusions, the role of national regulatory authorities, particularly with regard to ensuring there is adequate threat detection, by way of actually assuring that there is resilience in the first place. And some of the language in those new provisions adopted by PEGA in their final report or draft report are on the screen there. Notably, calls on member states to ensure that competent national authorities evaluate telecom providers' level of resilience to unauthorized intrusions. So in conclusion, there are system-level barriers to intelligence production, which precede organizational barriers to sharing because they impede the actual generation of intelligence in the first place. The very real vicious circle of a two-speed telecom security ecosystem today inhibits the production of mobile threat intelligence. Moreover, conventional cyber threat intelligence production is increasingly implicated by systemic deficiencies in signaling intelligence. And I will refer actually here briefly to a point made by Kieran Martin about wholesale data breaches. Think of this as a death by 1,000 cuts of data privacy and data protection, where it's not the single intrusion in a 24-hour period in respect of any one network or number of subscribers that will see 800,000 or numbers like that of subscribers, personal identifiers being exfiltrated, but repeated intrusions where there's unmitigated attack activity by an attacker for an extended period of time can reach those substantial levels, even though in every single instance, an attacker knows to stay below the radar of quantitative reporting thresholds, for example, which is why qualitative reporting requirements can provide a critical catalyst for incident reporting and capability development. And finally, my final point is that since the capacity to produce intelligence actually predetermines our sharing potential, the road to propagation must actually be paved with signaling protection, which is to say, paved with capability. As the GSMA highlight here, one organization detection is another's prevention. So detection comes first. Thank you all for your attention. I think we might have 1 minute plus for questions.
Terrific, Rowland. Brilliant presentation and brilliant timing. Thank you. I'm just going to ask you to go back. Would you mind going back to your vicious circle? I think you're controlling your own slides there, are you not?
Yes,
you want to just drop back to your vicious circle? Because I just want to share my perception with you. It'd be interesting to know if others have the same view. So I got it with the exception of the first quarter. The first quarter, I wasn't quite clear. There we go, right there. So once we get to the second box on the right, the signaling threats all the way around, I get it. Would you mind just elaborating a little bit on the first top right there, where you talked about siloing of cybersecurity as IT inhibits collaborative knowledge creation of threat actor and activities? Can I just ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, if you would?
Surely. So in engagement that I would have had in my public sector career, I encountered quite a widespread perception that signaling related activity was not a part of cybersecurity as defined. So this is what's highlighted by the by Enea. Actually, they had, which is the actual point that I made. And so siloing, talking about a rigid framework and a rigid approach to what is and isn't a cyber threat. And it's also reflected in the difference in systems and tools that are actually involved in the threat detection to begin with. and the different systems, and the fact that the cyber, so it becomes a very, very much focused on internet-borne threats. That's what I'm speaking about. So so this is the, in other words, let's talk about it's the maturation of cybersecurity as it is today, which has been focused on, I guess, IT environment related and computer related threats. And then even as the sharing frameworks and all have developed, it's reinforced that focus in that context, which has been good need for, of course, because it's been so difficult to keep pace with the development of threats in that context. But as we said, threat actors don't confine, state level threat actors prosecute their objectives using more and attacking more than IT environments.
For sure. Very good, Rowland. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Welcome. Thank you all.